They say that true evil never dies. We tend to disagree. Hello there. I am glad that you've joined me here. Today I will introduce to you one of the most famous monster hunting tools. A stake. It's impossible to talk about hunting the vampires without mentioning a wooden stake. From classic books about Dracula to the real vampire burials, pinning down bodies of the reputed undead was crucial in preventing their revenants or rising from the graves, if you want to get straight to the point. How did such a simple item become the bane of the vampires? First, the term vampire was coined in the 18th century and it was used to describe a creature we know from books and movies. Before that, many cultures described monsters with traits that we would today describe as vampiric, but which were known under different names. We will cover this topic in the near future, but for now we will use the word vampire as an umbrella term for many creatures that fed upon the living. We begin our undead hunting story mere 25,000 years in the past. Even in the Upper Paleolithic period, people were getting uneasy in the presence of the dead, and because of that they were doing everything to keep the dead in their graves. The earliest examples of such practices included placing the body face down, decapitation, placing a rock on top of the body, and binding the corpse. All those practices can be summarized in one word, coming from ancient Greek: maskalismos. In short, it is a set of actions that will prevent the body from rising back to life. Pinning the corpse with stakes and spikes is one of them. But it must be said that the stake wasn't always wooden. Graves from Southwell, Nottinghamshire, Sozopol in Bulgaria, and burials from the island of Lesbos show that people were often using metal prongs to hold the undead in their place. From simple nails to 20cm spikes driven through neck and feet, iron is a potent weapon against the undead. Objects made out of iron play an important role in apotropaic magic and have the power to scare away evil spirits. Because of that feature, when burying a potential Nagtseira or Videganga, you should place some iron objects in the grave. A key was a popular choice, but if you want to be extra certain, place a sickle with the blade lying across the throat of the creature. Lodging iron splinters, blades, bolts, or even pieces of a plow was a common practice throughout the ages, just like placing the body face down or cutting off the head and placing it between the legs or at the feet. In the tight grave, the undead could not reach his body parts and thus would remain in place. Simple, isn't it? To properly use the stake, you would also need one more thing: a hammer. And I don't mean those flimsy toys that you can find in some vampire hunting kits. You don't want to get too close to the undead, which might be carrying some nasty flesh-eating disease, do you? Get yourself a proper hammer that can also serve as a weapon to smash the head of the vampire into 1,000 pieces. Oh, and one more thing. Order your henchmen to hammer down the stakes. You don't want to stand too close when things get dirty. Pieces of undead can absolutely ruin your cloak. Also, when somebody calls the police, you won't be caught standing knee-deep in an open grave. Though piercing the heart of the vampire seems to be the most popular way of using the stake in the movies, books and TV, archaeological evidence does not support this method. At least, not completely. The purpose of pinning the corpse is pretty straightforward: to prevent the undead from rising again. For people living in the past, it seemed that the location of the stake isn't as important as immobilizing the potential undead. Ribcage, neck, mouth, solar plexus, pelvis, ankles, and feet were all good spots for a spike. But it must be said that the heart played an important role when dealing with the undead. Of course, the heart is a vital organ, and piercing it with a piece of metal or wood will definitely kill somebody, dead or otherwise. Folklore shows the importance of the heart by pointing it as a source of vital power. Because of that, many beliefs include stories about eating the heart of the enemies or animals in order to absorb their abilities. Drinking blood to gain life force comes from the same vein of thinking, if you prefer cardiovascular metaphors. Different sources tell us that after opening the grave, the heart of the undead wasn't pierced with a stake, but rather cut out, as described in the story by William of Newburgh. Then, dragging the body of the undead beyond the village, they speedily constructed a funeral pile, and upon one of them saying that the body would not burn unless its heart were torn out, the other laid open its side by repeated blows of the blunted spade, and, thrusting in his hand, dragged out the accursed heart. This being torn piecemeal, the body now consigned to the flames. Cutting out and burning the heart of the undead was the best way to sever any connection between a vampire and the world of the living, especially between the undead and its family. Sometimes that custom was taking a more gruesome form, and ashes from burned organs were eaten by living relatives of the vampire. One of the latest examples of such a practice can be traced to the 19th century United States. The case of Jewett City vampires and the story of Mercy Brown, who died in the year 1892, shows that the belief in the undead and apotropaic magic was still alive among the people of New England. In this case, Mary was considered a vampire because her body wasn't decomposing, which wasn't surprising considering she died in January. Nevertheless, Mary was blamed for preying upon her brother, Edwin, and inducing pneumonia upon him. Edwin was fed with the cremated remains of his sister's heart and liver in hope to cure his ailment. In vain, he died shortly afterwards. But let's return to the topic at stake. Impaling the undead wasn't always the best way to vanquish it. Let's take a look at an account from 1336 when a herdsman from Bohemia emerged from his grave. He was passing time by having pleasant conversations with some villagers and murdering the other. To make matters worse, everyone who encountered the undead was doomed to die within 8 days. In order to keep him in his grave, a stake was driven through his body, but he only laughed at this clumsy attempt to impale a ghost, saying,
"You have really rendered me a great service by providing me with a staff with which to ward off the dogs when I go out to walk."
When the stake failed, the villagers decided to burn the undead, and that method yielded results. The creature began to yell and scream and ceased after he was stabbed in the side. That fragment tells us two things. Firstly, the stake isn't the ultimate weapon against the vampires, and secondly, the described stake was most likely much longer than the usual peg seen in the movies or books. Otherwise, the creature would not compare it to the walking staff. Most likely the stakes used to pin the undead were originally spears or sharpened poles, just like this one. So, is there any reason why the stake should be made out of wood? After all, iron seems to be a much better choice considering its endurance, hardness and the power to ward off evil spirits. Trees, however, possess a different kind of magic. No matter where you travel, you will encounter sacred groves, holy trees and spirits that live just beneath the bark. You just need to look in the right places. Trees played an important role in beliefs across the globe, and you can find a faint echo of those myths in the form of a wooden stake. After all, you cannot make a weapon against a vampire from cheap plywood, can you? Ash, for example, is famous for its endurance. It's a symbol of power, solidity and immortality, which can be traced to the Norse mythology and the Yggdrasil, the tree of life. The Scandinavian people believed that ash is a tree that will ensure purity of springs and land around it. The Romans also held ash in high regard, treating it as a symbol of protection. Aspen is another tree with a long and rich history. It was used to make shields, build households, and was considered a symbol of protection. With its small leaves that tremble in the wind, aspen tree was often linked with the presence of spirits, whispering to those that are willing to listen. With the rise of Christianity, the old beliefs were labeled as evil, and thus aspen wood was given a new role. The tree now trembles in shame after supplying wood for the crucifixion cross. Yet, that addition only strengthened the notion that the stake from aspen tree will be a good choice to craft stakes against the undead. Another example of a good tree for a stake is hawthorn, a symbol of love and fertility in Celtic mythology, but also a tree associated with fairies and powers that mortals should not trifle with. Cutting down hawthorn was considered bad luck, but the living tree was linked with a presence of a protective spirit. Oak is a symbol of strength, endurance, and power that was associated with Zeus, Dagda, Perun, or Thor, mighty patrons indeed. After all, few trees are as resilient as an oak. Often it is the highest tree in the forest, and with durability to survive a lightning strike, oak was rightfully considered the king of the trees and a potent material for a stake to fight the undead. There is a lot to say about trees and their use in the monster hunting profession, but that's a story for another time. I think he's had enough. Let's go. Thank you for joining me today, and as always, I will see you next time.